Enemy spotted! Guess they aren't done yet. You hear that? Double.
Dude, I sped boosted him. He didn't know how fast he was about to go, and he actually fell off the map. It was so funny to see.
What's going on, guys? It's Frito here for your Overwatch. I've been grinding Overwatch Classic and have done all of the challenges and had lots of fun and have a lot to say about what it means for the game of Overwatch and what we can learn going into the further format discussions we'll be having over the next several months and seasons. There's a lot of competing philosophies on the direction the game should go next. And to me, it's actually a lot more complicated than just 5v5 and 6v6. They already have planned classic events to return for different patches. We're going to be getting the Moth meta and then Goats after that. But for the remaining few weeks, it's going to maintain as patch 1.0. Now let's get into the review, starting off with the good section, which is going to be quite long. I have a lot of good things to say. A general one, that these format playlists are a no-brainer. We've been asking for these things on the Group Up podcast for what feels like years now, and well, the devs listened to that show and put in the time, it seems, on the technical side, maybe as much as a year ago, to make this into a reality. The cool part about this to me is it's indicative of the good guy Blizzard attitude that Team 4 is trying to set for themselves. I haven't heard anybody say this, but this is a bunch of work they put into a mode that alienates the new content, which is what makes money, as well as skins. There's no skins in this mode. And then, of course, as a hero ban advocate since Brig was released, format discussions have been the thing I've wanted in this game for years and years. So them being bold to add a main playlist, which effectively bans all of the new content, not only does it work, it works amazingly, and I think it's the only way we should consider Overwatch to be a viable game into the years of the future. It can't just be we only play the full version of all of the newest heroes and whatever mistakes and byproducts and maps that they decide at that given time. These different isolated formats or hero bans or more depth of strategy to mix things up is a very welcome change, because I think players went into this mode knowing and expecting it to be bad in a lot of ways. And because of that, they were much more forgiving of the things that were bad, myself included. Whereas if we have this expectation that the game should be balanced or should make sense or should have a certain result, well, that's where you start to get into trouble and somebody's going to be disappointed. It was very easy not to be disappointed in this mode after playing it enough to really understand the personality of what to expect from Overwatch Classic. So getting over that, I got to be able to focus on the unique gameplay. This is certainly something that Overwatch 2 doesn't provide, because so many of the heroes are competitively homogenous, competing for similar jobs. It's refreshing to go back and play Assault, a game mode that I loved, or see heroes that are very different and unique and niche with their playstyles. Of course, there was reasons why they moved away from that. We'll get into that later, but it seemed to me that the player base we had in Overwatch Classic wanted to be there to play that version of the game and was much more flexible than what I remember players being in 2016. I saw lots of bad team comps and not a lot of complaining. People maybe rage quit if they didn't want to try to fight their way through the choke of Anubis without a tank or a healer, but other than that, generally people seemed to be signing up for the wacky experience that Overwatch Classic was going to be, and that made it way more fun. 2CP, of course, doesn't have its competitive rule set where you played both sides, but I always thought Assault played great in quick play, with the acknowledgement that, like, well, it's kind of hard to win on certain sides. But as it turns out, as Aaron Keller even acknowledged in the 6v6 blog, those higher highs and lower lows are part of the appeal. If you go into a game knowing you have insurmountable odds, it makes achieving those odds much more satisfying when you do. And that goes for a lot of the gameplay, like how do we win with a bad comp? How do we get a wacky strategy to work? How do we counter-strat, or counter-pick, the enemy's comp, which is rolling us? Those decisions are way more impactful than they are in Overwatch 2, because a lot of Overwatch 2 is like, just perform mechanically on your hero a bit better. A lot of people think it's counterpicking as well, but I don't really think so. Most roles, most things, you can actually out-mechanic, whereas there's way more general macro strategy in play with Overwatch Classic. Especially when you consider the fact that you're looking to maybe win one main fight in Assault, as opposed to needing to win a bunch of brawl fights in a row in just about every tug-of-war style mode that they put to make Overwatch 2 more brawly. To all these points, note that in the Spilo interview with the developers, they also echoed the fact that they're looking to put more strategy into the game. That's a thing that they've been repeating for a while now. And of course, we've had a string of alternate game modes, most recently Junkenstein's Lab, which had sort of skill tree passives, the best version of those that we've seen thus far. And they keep saying and repeating that they want you to be able to make more choices beyond just what hero you select in the game. That interests me a bit because there's things in Overwatch Classic 1.0 that they sort of just didn't tolerate to exist too long, like Symmetra having a teleporter that takes you from spawn to a location, meaning that you can like win more on an entrenched position or do some wacky attack strategy to get your respawning team into the backline of the enemy on assault. Those things are cute and interesting, but they're so boom or bust that they eventually went away from that. However, if you have deeper strategy considerations, you can have a skill tree where a few ideas are maybe niche, but having entirely niche characters ended up not really working for Overwatch because a lot of the player base wanted to one trick or main them. And how do you main something that's deliberately niche, right? That's the problem that they came up against when they further developed the middle of the game in the power creep era. But that also, to me, was a major benefit of patch 1.0 Overwatch Classic. It's deliberately unbalanced, okay? They went on to try to balance it a bit, but the devs originally kind of didn't care about balance, and there's a benefit to that in a way that no one really wanted to hear me out on in Overwatch 1, kind of similar to positions that I take in Overwatch 2 that no one really wants to hear me out on now either. But the downside of balance, we already know what it looks like because so many players complain about it now, but don't realize that balance is the reason. If you make the free hero swap format balanced, what that will result in 100% of the time is counterpicking. Because if you need a hero like Symmetra to be as reliable somewhat on an even playing field to Tracer, then when there's an opportunity for Symmetra to shine, her unique playstyle will shine hard. That's what balance looks like in our format. What I wanted all these years was hero bans or draft, where you allowed the hero cast to be divergent, almost like a fighting game, where yeah, there's some niche playstyles here, there's some more competitive ones there, but if we want a real competitive experience, we'll just ban and pick and ban our way to sort of balance that out. With that mindset, we would have never needed to try to make the builder heroes as reliable as Widow, Tracer, Genji, and Cassidy. I lost that battle, of course, over years, and I'm not so sure we love the results. Back then, it would have been bad to have one tricks of niche heroes on your team. It was super annoying, but now we have a different problem where all of the heroes are pretty close and the strategies are so competitive that counterpicking is a lot better. Or at least more obviously pervasive because it's 5v5, less players to clog everything up. Counterpicking was also amazingly good in Overwatch Classic, but it was less one-to-one. It was more the general macro team comp, which you could maybe suffocate the enemy from playing the game entirely if you had the right comp, and equally make massive counterpick plays if you, say, went Tracer and hunted their solo healer Mercy. I actually liked this as a player, covering the game for years as well, having a big benefit to your counterpicking strategy, netting with solving the entire team comp equation was something that I really enjoyed for years, wanting to succeed without being as skilled. Overwatch 2, much harder to do that. You gotta smash all your buttons and hit your abilities to compete. The team comps were so much more diverse in Overwatch 1. So because of that, what you picked had a much bigger ramification on whether your team could win or lose. While I certainly stand by the fact that I think team comp and hero selection matters so much more in Overwatch Classic or 6v6, one thing that I was pleasantly surprised by is that it feels like the player base is far better at the game than I remember them being in 2016, which stands to reason. The game's been out so many years, but back then, often you would feel like you couldn't move without a shield tank in front of you. But now, after playing lots of different types of metas, and we are Overwatch 2 players after all, it seems most people know how to use cover and can get value out of their individual hero without doing a lot of the same lemmings type behavior that was really common in Overwatch 1. It's hard for me to describe what this is, but often you'd see lots of teams like trying to go in and play like they've got a shield in front of them, but don't. It's funny to say, but it's like you almost get your muscle memory trained in a certain way in Overwatch where you sort of expect to be able to take certain space, but then you don't have the right comp around it to do that, and then you get blown up. That was really, really common in Overwatch 1 for years. But now, since we are in Overwatch 2, I think most players look like they're used to needing to find their own cover and be sustainable on their own, which would have been nice for that to be the case in Overwatch 1 originally. Further, it just felt like players knew the different win conditions of the weird team comps that could match up. There was less cluelessness on what to do if you had a really wacky team comp. And I think that just yields to the experience of the player base. And certainly has been perhaps the one thing that I'm willing to move my heart on when it comes to the 5v5, 6v6 debate. That if we have this kind of player base, they could be ready for a more complex format with more buttons and synergy and team play. Maybe going back to that wouldn't be as much of a travesty as I thought it could have been. But then again, it's not like they integrated Overwatch Classic to the whole game. The people playing this signed up for it, separate from quick play and competitive Overwatch 2, which already exists. We might get different results if it was forced on the entire player base, but again, that's not necessarily the argument that's being had. The devs have wanted to see, do they make these alternate play modes and formats a constant? And as they said in the Spilo interview, it's not really on the table to erase 5v5, which I think they weren't so clear about before, but now seemingly are more decided that that's the case, it sounds like. But I don't see why there wouldn't be room for them to have a separate 6v6 competitive playlist. Either entirely Overwatch Classic with like Assault and everything, or other versions of it. I don't know what the numbers of interest were, but they did seem to indicate that Overwatch Classic was doing quite well, as one of the alternate arcade modes go. Now I want to go on and talk about the launch 1.0 patch and why some of that plays better and how we might learn or give up on certain ideas. I will note that the upcoming 2 patches, I won't be so nice towards. Goats, obviously, that's a travesty of a balance patch and a hero release and all that. Who knows if the average player will even select the Goats comp on the Goats patch, because it wasn't necessarily so popular. Depends on which patch they put it on, but Valk for sure was a serious problem for the game. By that point, they would have introduced hero limits, which arise cultural problems in matchmaking where you'll get maybe multiple Mercy one-tricks on your team, and only one of them gets to play Mercy. And then even worse, what happens if you don't have a Mercy player and she's the strongest hero by far in the history of the game, probably. I think even stronger than Brig, because Mercy got like basically passive value. Brig at least had to engage and then get her insane stats to work. But we're not talking about those patches. Going to the launch 1.0 patch, very unbalanced, but some key takeaways that there was no burst heal. So that means when things were low, they stayed low for a long time. It wasn't like I get to brawl, hold my position, and then this boom, big cooldown comes in to heal me, like Bap's regenerative burst in Overwatch 2, or Ana's Nade, which will be coming in the first hero release in Overwatch Classic, in theory, if you follow the timeline. In general, supports were just supports, like even Lucio, who I think I have a minority opinion on this, but I loved playing Lucio. He's one of my most played heroes in the history of the game. Got to some of my highest ranks playing him as well, but I preferred him in the style where it was hard for him to win duels, because it was more satisfying when you actually did, and it allowed you to focus on more of a commander teammate playstyle, actual support. But then he got reworked to be basically Genji with a heal aura. And then, of course, on top of that, there was a cultural problem where, although on the competitive scene, he had like a near 100% competitive pick rate among pro players, he wasn't very popular for the longest time for the average players. I feel like that might have went up a bit over time, especially when they made him more of a duelist and focused more on his Reddit Lucio shenanigans with a stronger boop and wall ride. But I'm not so sure in hindsight that was good for the health of the game, even if it made that hero more popular to the players that want to play him. The devs never really squared the circle of the problems of the cultural expectations and popularity of different heroes. Main tanks and main supports always felt great to play with, but we had a drought of players to play them. Having builders on your team was a detriment, but rather than expecting the player base to switch their playing behaviors or hashtag get good, instead the devs like reworked everything to try to normalize it out to give us the results based on the inputs the players put in, and I'm not so sure that was the best way to go. Regardless, though, a general theme of the patch is power creep is gone. The baseline power of Overwatch 2 characters is insane. They've all got 1 escape, 2 escape, insta-kill, burst utility, mobility. The heroes are insane. Whereas in Overwatch 1.0, the whole game is very, very slow and deliberate, and I like that as an old man. While Reinhardt might be a pain to play, especially with how easily he gets knocked around and how easily punished he is if he's 1 foot out of position, It sort of is like playing Dark Souls or maybe Dota, which also has very punishing movement mechanics. There's reward to that high skill ceiling and floor for it to be so punishing. Over time and years, they really tried to make the game more approachable to pick up, and I'm not so sure it's better for the long term. It felt really nice that certain heroes like Roadhog Take a Breather or Reaper Wraithform were punishable. There's a lot of heroes that press Q to die, which maybe was a mockery and a meme at the time, but is it better that we press Q to insta-win? Or was it more rewarding when ultimates were maybe a bit niche sometimes and you had to set them up and execute them? The player base really mocked the devs for a lot of these things, but then once you get all that reliability and power, well, then it becomes less about your execution and more about existing with those abilities at the right time, at the right place. Thankfully, that's not how the Overwatch 1.0 patch felt or played like. Winston is a good example because he's very, very good, but very punishable at the same time. It felt like you were a supporting cast member, not the star of the game, which also helped a bit because like so much wasn't necessarily on your shoulders, it felt like, because there's a lot of other things going on. And this has nothing to do with whether you have another tank or not, just like you're just one of the 6 teammates and you're not actually that powerful on your own, but your decision making had big ramifications. And just by the nature of tank power being low deliberately, it meant like you AFK'd a lot more. Whereas in Overwatch 2, you're constantly in the play, you're constantly brawling, you're constantly getting resources, you constantly need to make plays, you constantly gotta hit shots, you constantly gotta land your mechanics. Whereas tank in Overwatch 1, other than the very popular Zarya, it really was just about standing in the right place. And keep in mind, I liked that because it took far less skill than needing to juggle playing a hero shooter mega game where you need 1,000 APM just to play main tank. And those trade-offs aren't necessarily worth it for a lot of players. If you have less mechanical skill and want to play a supportive style main tank, where it's more about just anchoring in a good position and timing with your team, well, 6v6 and Overwatch 1 Classic brings that back for you. It also felt like there's severe limits on your power, and maybe you want to rage swap off because you think your team isn't making use of the space or timing you're making. That's also true too. Like both of these things can be true at the same time. Role queue in a way will make this feel worse because you'll be stuck on that role and just have to figure out how to deal with your bad picks or playstyles of your teammates, and you can't swap roles to overcompensate for them. I feel a little strange because I either like lots of the pressure and shooter gameplay specifically for the tank role in 5v5, or I really liked having the low impact main tank playstyle from Overwatch 1, but not many people did. I think when most people talk about the tank gameplay from 6v6, they want the cooldown cycling that's going to happen later once they start adding more complex heroes and really emphasizing the tank battle. If anything, if you weren't a Zarya in patch 1.0, tank was certainly supportive. But that for me makes it much more of a shooter game, even more of a shooter game than 5v5 Overwatch 2 does. That's crazy to think. We're going to move on into the bad section now. This is maybe the downsides of things I also like. You know, I got complex feelings about it, but the balance of launch Overwatch is like there were certain carry picks and there were certain, I hope I can help my team with this pick. Oh no, wait, it's hopeless. I probably should be on a carry pick myself if I want to win. Like that was a reality. There's a handful of characters that carry the game, and then most other characters are kind of spectating around, watching, hoping to help. Whether it's Pharah, Widow, Cassidy, Genji, Tracer, the balance biases a bit more towards Widow on this given patch, I feel. They changed her body shot rather quickly in the history of the game, so she couldn't one-shot a Tracer to the body. But you constantly feel like certain picks are secondary to being able to carry the game, for sure. That's not how you feel in other stages of Overwatch 2, especially when they make Valk the strongest thing in the game in the next patch, or I think even on live Overwatch 2, the roles are really balanced. And while there's some characters that are harder to carry on than others, all of the characters are buffed up to the point where you can see the path to carry the game. That's like how they've been balanced intentionally, with them trying to balance the win rates, right? So that's been forced. And I was the one that said for years to not balance based on pick rates. It's a dumb idea. I don't want it. It doesn't make the gameplay better necessarily. And I feel more emboldened in that take with a blast of the past in 2016. I don't think the community necessarily agrees with me on this, so that's why I do have it in the bad section. But for me, it's good. I think the reality of balance in Overwatch in any iteration is a handful of heroes will be the main contributors, and the best thing that we can do is balance the game towards skill expression. And I feel like the only one who plays the tank and support roles that actually asks them to be weak, because I want to feel like I'm supporting the team, that my decisions matter, as opposed to just like my stats easily winning. I think that's lame. I'm kind of fine with there being have and have-nots, especially when you consider the fact that patch 1.0, the have and have-nots bias towards the shooter characters. I forgot kinda that was the case. Like, holy moly, it's such a shooter game. I was trying to tell you guys, like when the game launched, we wanted to play all the shooter characters. I've been hearing arguments about how like tank supports and synergy and all that was why people like 6v6. That's why it won Game of the Year, I was told. There's no tank synergy in Overwatch 1.0. What are you talking about? You can play Ryan Zarya, but I hardly saw Ryan Zarya. The game certainly didn't win Game of the Year for 6v6. And there certainly wasn't any teamwork or synergy natural in the game, especially when you remember just how useless D.Va was in her first iteration. This whole idea of a peeling off tank didn't even exist. They reworked it into the game in 2017 when D.Va became overpowered, being able to mask a teammate, causing the dive meta that lasted over a year, and then D.Va had like a even bigger reign of competitive dominance over the off-tank category, even ahead of, I think, Lucio when it all came down to the historical pick rates of Overwatch 1. So tank synergy, yeah, maybe good for competitive gameplay, but not great for balance, because D.Va dominated that category once she had the ability to work with her team like that, because it was oppressive. I actually liked the game in patch 1.0 because, well, it turns out the game wasn't designed to have tank synergy. It sort of felt like each tank kind of functioned on its own. Yeah, you could bubble one of the tanks, but it's not like you had burst healing to make sure you could keep that main tank in position. Winston or Reinhardt were ushering the team into a position. They weren't holding their ground, getting giga-pocketed by multiple cooldowns, making everything all in on that character. Once Ana gets put into the game, the main tank could become the carry. And that's where you got the tank synergy, because competitive team comps were built around that AoE healing, right? So to say that it launched like that, it was just not even true, man. The game didn't win Game of the Year for tank synergy, guys. It didn't even exist. But in any case, not having role queue certainly hurts the experience, because supports aren't so popular in this version, bar Mercy. Like, Mercy was very popular, but Lucio was far stronger and doesn't really get picked if he's not a duelist, which maybe makes me very happy because I love playing him, but that's clearly a problem with this format. Like, the things that make the gameplay better aren't necessarily popular, so you don't even necessarily get to access that peak gameplay that you think you're going to get when you think about the on-paper potential of what this format can yield. Also in the bad category, just more talk about unbalanced guys. Like, Widow is insane, can body shot a tracer. Cassidy's Fan the Hammer deleted a tank. So good luck with that whole tank experience concept being better in Overwatch 1. We used to have the concept that it was just like okay for there to be tank buster heroes. You just can't straight up face a Bastion when he's set up. So in general, the game very clearly has the team comp RPG builder-a-thon that I thought ruined the competitive experience, because a lot of it came down to, does your team comp interact with theirs? And while there's certain heroes that have carry impact, if your team comp is significantly at a disadvantage, it felt impossible to carry. Back in 2016, a little bit more so now, maybe because I'm better or people are more accustomed to how to make adjustments to certain things. So it wasn't as pervasive as I thought it was, but it did still happen where you can't move out of spawn and the mismatch of your comps is insane and no one hero will help. If 5v5, one hero makes a big difference, in 6v6, it kind of might not be even close to enough. And this is just a bit of a truism about having more players in any shooter game. The more players you populate onto a map, the more expensive it becomes to clear them off that space. So it makes it harder to move, basically. Less players, easier to gain space. And when you are dealing with a game like Overwatch, where there is counter-stratting involved, that makes that more punishing. But I think to some degree, we'll never get this to be a perfect balance between movability and playability. If anything, going back to Overwatch 1.0 just reminds me, like, man, this is a crazy game. And I want to go back to things I said in years past during Overwatch 1, like, let this game be what it is. I'm fatigued by the arguments that are trying to make the game work from every perspective possible. That's just not going to be the case. Okay, guys, like the downsides of every format decision are so severe. We need to get over the idea that any singular answer is going to fix anything. You can't fix this game, guys, because I've already said radical things that I like about the launch version of the game. I mean, I covered it, of course, in 2016 that a lot of people don't agree with. Already, they've been writing comments the whole time. There's several essays about how I'm crazy for wanting the game to be unbalanced, and I'm wrong about, I don't know, so many things that I've said somehow. No one agrees on this stuff, guys. A thing that I did definitely notice, Mercy players are better than what I remember. And then on top of that, rezzing through the walls is terrible. They eventually went away from that and forced her to have line of sight, but mass res was super obnoxious in this version of the game. In general, the ult fight felt super dumb and less tactical, mainly because of res. It was such a coin flip on whether or not the ult investment from one team completely was negated by one ult on the enemy team that it really killed a lot of the strategy for me. And I remember defending res at the time, but I think I liked the other changes they made to it. Like they made her put her body on the line more. I think they made there be a casting animation, so there's a small window where you could punish her. Definitely when she has to stand out in the open, that's better. But I think this just gives a small glimpse into the potential of what 6v6 can devolve into. And I think that'll be even more obvious on the next two patches, especially when they get to the GOATS meta, which was largely kept together based on the buffs they made to certain ultimates. It wasn't just Brig, but it's like they buffed sound barrier. So even if you worked up to a DPS ult, the sound barrier got buffed to a point where it would counter a Pharah ult, as opposed to like withstand a lot of it, but still lose. That's a big deal on those breakpoints in the ult fight. And when the numbers start getting out of control and the different characters, the design of the game got out of control really fast. And playing Overwatch Classic just sent me back down memory lane of how traumatic that was and how much more reasonable Overwatch 2 is in comparison, largely thanks to 5v5. Because in 6v6, the downsides of any given hero having an outmoded performance is way more. Because the reality of 6v6 that I really noticed is like the ramifications of your teammates' decisions, both in what they pick and where they move and when they fight, really affects you. Because whether you're trying to clutch and pull back a team fight 1v2 or 1v3 or 1v6 is way, way different, right? Like if there's a few characters you could meaningfully interact with on the enemy team just to begin with based on the matchup of your hero, then on top of that, they've got man advantage. The more men you add to that equation, the less likely you have any chance to turn the fight yourself. 5v5 fights are way more turnable because of this principle. Any individual hero has more positive matchups to meaningfully affect. So while it's very samey and maybe is boring for that regard, Overwatch 2 is far more brawly and you're constantly like soft resetting, looking for a duel here on the side. It's way more formulaic, but it's way more actively skillful. Whereas in 6v6, oftentimes your skill is just null and void, doesn't matter. I think really high skilled streamers can make the mode look better than it is, because if you are a top 50 in the world player, any lobby you go into, maybe you can outskill 4 players playing Tracer or Widow or something. But for the average player, it's just insurmountable basically a lot of times. And in fact, I'm going to consider that part of the ugly section, because a lot of what I just described is not so much of a competitive game. Like sometimes the game's an absolute joke. Luckily, going back in time, I think altered our perception. We knew what we were getting into, so I didn't really see anybody upset at the joke gameplay that often was on my screen, but I think it's easy to see how that gameplay got us from that point into evolving towards having Moira, Brig, and Bap in those categories, characters that a lot of analysts would blame for the downfall of the game, but the alternative was we stayed in a realm where support was widely unpopular for the most part. Mainstream players didn't, in my experience, going back, play Lucio, and he's amazing, right? Like he's the fair support, but people didn't want to play him. How do the devs solve that problem? And I don't think they ever can. We either allow players to choose who they want to pick and allow them to pick heroes that make our lives harder, or we create formats where it's kind of required. Like, would it be different if, say, in the GOATS version of the patch, everyone just had to pick the GOATS comp? I think it would, actually. Like, I've sort of said this, like, the whole free swap format has been casual the whole time. Better is hero bans, in my opinion, or a draft, but beyond that is like a forced mirror match, which I don't like. That's not what I want personally, but at least then when you signed up for the support role, you know what your options are, as opposed to either the no limits format or the no hero duplicates format. Either way, there's a lot of variance on, do you even have the pieces of the team comp you want to be running or not? That is really, really ugly for gameplay, and will look more ugly as the balance gets more severe in the next 2 patches of Overwatch Classic. But I've already seen it in the first week, mainly just like if the enemy picks multiple tanks and your team picks less tanks, but runs at the tanks. You can counterpick multi-tank, but you got to pick more range, flank, and DPS. That's always been the case. But for some reason, sometimes players don't seem to know that. Like, they'll take their 1 Reinhardt to go fight their 3 tanks, and there's nothing we can do to help you. And you can't even outplay it. So in general, in this kind of game, you do need your teammates to function, or they make severe ripple effects on you, which can suck. Makes for a very unreliable experience, but it may be a uniquely Overwatch experience at the end of the day, and we just sort of accept that that's a major downside that we have to live with, at least in any 6v6 mode, I think. One last ugly thing, I think projectiles were really different. My hot take is I like how the Season 9 projectiles feel, but overall, it's considered negligible on balance. Post-Season 9, though, I think Pharah is a massive, massive winner. But because she already was pretty decent in different iterations of the game, I don't think maybe that's as acknowledged as is reality. I have mixed feelings about the projectiles. Like, on one hand, it feels good how hard it is to hit Lucio projectiles. On the other hand, they feel very loose, like they're hard to connect with. So there's a certain degree of luck involved. And while top 500 players are still complaining about Widowmaker, I think it was much harder to use projectiles against a hit scan in Overwatch 1.0, especially when she had more health and your projectiles were objectively harder to hit. That gap has certainly closed a bit, and the community doesn't really seem to acknowledge that. Like Hanzo versus Widow right now on live, if you're not in top 500, is pretty darn fair. And at least for me, I don't feel like I need to play a hit scan at any point in Overwatch 2 in the current iteration of the game, and I do play damage a decent amount, except for the fact that Widow is a powerhouse right now. So that would be like the one exception, but to make it seem like Widow wasn't a powerhouse at launch either that's just not true. I mean, the hero's been insane the entire time. We just used to actually think it was worth the skill you put in to play her. That was the sentiment back then. And there was a growing current of players that appreciate the other roles of the game, tank support and flex DPS, that have kind of built a coalition against the sniper. My opinion on the matter is balance shouldn't be used as the tool to deal with this problem. Instead, format should be, especially various ones, and none other creates more variation than hero bans, but these limited time play patches, I think, are a great idea as well. Overall, a lot of good to say, guys, don't you think? Like, I went into Overwatch Classic a little bitter at the start of it, but I pretty quickly grew to love so many aspects about it. It was really refreshing, a change of pace, and just kind of taught me, like, I love every version of this game, really. Like, as long as there's ways for me to find the gameplay within the format and system that I love, I'm gonna have a good time, and in both iterations, it seems like I can do that. But I think regardless, we should work on changing our perspective to fit the format we have rather than demanding that it be a different one, because they're always going to have trade-offs. No solutions, only trade-offs. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to leave it a like, and don't forget to hit subscribe and the bell icon to actually get notified when our videos come out. That's been it for me. I've been Frito for your Overwatch. I'll see you guys next time.
Let's get to it already. Did I miss something? Did I miss something?
I'm ready for pudding.